The veterans laughed when a 19-year-old girl walked into the most grueling military sniper trial on Earth. They called her a liability, a political stunt, a joke. But 72 hours later, bleeding and half-blind in a Mojave sandstorm, she didn't just save their lives, she rewrote the rules of modern warfare. The sun over the Niland training facility didn't just shine, it battered the earth like a physical weight. It was 114 degrees in the shade, and out on the firing line there was no shade. Heat waves shimmered violently off the hard-baked alkali flats, warping the silhouettes of the steel targets, situated exactly 1,000 yards downrange. Chief Petty Officer Thomas Hayes, known to the teams as Grizzly for his towering frame and notoriously foul temper, spit a stream of brown tobacco juice into the dust. He adjusted his spotting scope and scowled. Beside him were 5 seasoned Navy SEALs, all combat veterans, all men who had bled in the mountains of the Hindu Kush and the urban sprawl of Ramadi. They were here for the advanced sniper qualification, a brutal filter designed to take the elite and forge them into ghosts. And then there was Riley. Riley Mercer was 19 years old. She stood 5'5", weighing maybe 130 pounds soaking wet. Her presence on the firing line was the result of a highly classified experimental joint task integration program pushed down from the Pentagon brass. She was the first female candidate to ever make it through the initial SEAL pipeline and step foot onto this specific patch of desert. To the men standing beside her, she wasn't a pioneer. She was a liability. Look at her. Petty Officer First Class. Derek Cole muttered loud enough for the wind to carry his words down the line. Cole was a golden boy, a decorated operator with a jawline carved from granite and an ego to match. She looks like she's going to snap under the recoil. What's the over-under on her washing out by sundown? I give it 2 hours before she's crying for a medevac. Riley heard him. She didn't blink. She didn't turn her head. She lay prone in the suffocating dust, her cheek welded to the stock of a massive Macmillan TASI 3.38 sniper rifle. The weapon itself weighed 24 pounds, nearly a fifth of her body weight. What Cole and the others didn't know was that Riley hadn't learned to shoot in a sanitized military academy. She had been raised in the unforgiving backcountry of Wyoming by a reclusive, medically retired Marine Scout sniper. While other kids were learning to ride bicycles, Riley was learning how to read wind mirages and calculate spin drift. She had been taking down elk at 800 yards since she was 12. To her, the rifle wasn't a weapon. It was an extension of her central nervous system. "All right, listen up," roared Master Chief Brendan O'Connor, the lead instructor, pacing behind the line with his hands clasped behind his back. "Unknown distance drill. You have 3 minutes to range your targets, calculate your dope, and put 3 rounds of .338 Lapua Magnum into a 12-inch steel plate. If you miss, you run the berm. If you miss twice, you pack your bags. We do not tolerate tourists in this program. Shooter's preference. Fire on my whistle." Riley breathed in, smelling the harsh metallic scent of hot gun oil and baked dirt. She peered through her Night Force optic. The target was a grey smudge dancing in the heat mirage. She quickly calculated the distance using the mil dots in her reticle. Exactly 1,040 yards. She reached up to adjust her elevation turret, but as her fingers brushed the dial, her stomach dropped. The turret was loose. It hadn't just been bumped. The locking screw had been deliberately backed off. Her zero was completely wiped out. Someone had tampered with her rifle while it was in the rack during the morning physical training session. Riley's eyes cut fractionally to the right. Cole was smirking, already dialed in and waiting for the whistle. It was a classic hazing move, a test to see if the new girl would throw a tantrum, blame her equipment, and demand a restart. In the SEAL teams, excuses were a currency that bought you a one-way ticket home. She had 30 seconds. Panic was a luxury she couldn't afford. Riley closed her eyes, visualizing the turret's original position. She couldn't re-zero the weapon. There was no time. She would have to do something nearly impossible. She would have to fire a cold-bore shot track, the bullets splash in the dirt, calculate the mathematical offset in her head, and use the reticle's crosshairs to hold over the target without touching the dials, all in under 3 minutes. Twee! The whistle shrieked. Instantly the firing line erupted in a deafening chorus of thunder. Crack boom, crack boom. Massive gouts of dust kicked up from the muzzle brakes. Ping ping, steel rang out downrange as Hayes and Cole made their first hits. Riley exhaled a slow, controlled leak of air. At the bottom of her breath, she squeezed the trigger. The rifle violently kicked her shoulder, a massive transfer of kinetic energy. She kept both eyes open, fighting the recoil to look through the scope. A tiny puff of dirt kicked up on the berm behind the target, 2 feet high and 1 foot to the left. Miss. Mercer is off the plate, O'Connor barked, jotting something down on his clipboard. 1 Miss Mercer. You're bleeding out. Fix it. Cole chuckled, racking the bolt of his rifle. Told you. Riley didn't flinch. Her brain was already doing the math. 2 feet high at 1,000 yards is roughly 2 MOA. 1 foot left is 1 MOA. The wind is a full-value crosswind from the right at 7 miles per hour. She racked the bolt, ejecting the smoking brass casing, and chambered a new round. She didn't touch her turrets. Instead, she shifted her entire point of aim, placing the center crosshair in the empty air to the bottom right of the steel plate, using the tiny hash marks on the glass to measure the exact distance in the void. It felt incredibly unnatural, aiming at nothing to hit something. She breathed out. She pulled. Crack boom. A second and a half later, a sharp, distinct ping echoed back across the desert. Chief Hayes lowered his spotting scope, his thick eyebrows knitting together in surprise. Center mass, dead center Mercer. Riley cycled the bolt. 1 smooth motion. Breathe, hold, pull. Crack, boom, ping. Hit! Hayes grunted. Riley racked the bolt 1 last time, ignoring the searing heat of the chamber. Hold. Pull. Crack, boom. Ping. 3 hits. Hayes said, his voice dropping an octave. He turned to look at Riley. He had seen the first shot miss. He knew exactly what it meant to miss by that specific margin, and then perfectly stack the next 3 rounds into the center of the plate without touching the scope dials. It required a level of raw, innate ballistic intuition that took decades to master. Cole, who had just missed his 3rd shot due to a sudden wind shift, scowled deeply. Beginner's luck, he muttered aggressively, ejecting his magazine. Hayes didn't say anything, but his eyes lingered on Riley. The girl hadn't complained. She hadn't pointed fingers. She had simply adapted and overcome. As the instructors called an end to the drill, Hayes walked past Cole and deliberately bumped his shoulder. Check your windage, Cole, Hayes growled softly. And if you ever touch another shooter's glass again, I won't just fail you. I'll break your jaw. Cole went pale. Riley quietly picked up her brass casings, her expression unreadable. The trial had only just begun, but the phantom of Nyland had just made her presence known. By day 3, the desert had stripped away every illusion of glory. The candidates were bruised, severely dehydrated, and operating on less than 4 hours of sleep, spread across 72 hours. They were moving into the most critical phase of the trial, the stalk. The objective was deceptively simple. Each sniper was to infiltrate a 2-mile stretch of scrubland. At night, navigate to a designated firing point, identify a high-value target, an instructor sitting in a Humvee, fire a single blank round, and exfiltrate all without being detected by the cadre of instructors sweeping the area with state-of-the-art thermal imaging and night vision. It was 2,300 hours. The temperature had plummeted to a bone-chilling 45 degrees. Riley was buried under a heavy ghillie suit made of burlap and jute, crawling on her stomach through the sharp creosote bushes. Her movements were agonizingly slow. She advanced inches at a time, sliding her rifle forward, then pulling her body up to meet it. To her left, about 50 yards away, was Derek Cole. He was moving too fast. Riley could hear the faint crunch of gravel under his boots. Cole was impatient, eager to finish the drill and get back to the barracks. He was relying entirely on his physical endurance rather than the meticulous art of invisibility. Suddenly the wind changed. It didn't just shift, it howled. The temperature dropped another 10 degrees in a matter of minutes. Riley paused, pressing her cheek against the cold sand. The horizon to the west had disappeared, swallowed by a towering ink-black wall that seemed to touch the stars. A haboob, a massive, freak desert sandstorm. Within seconds the storm hit. It was like stepping into a blast furnace of abrasive grit. Visibility dropped from a mile to less than 10 feet. The roar of the wind drowned out everything, the radio static in their earpieces, the sound of the instructors' vehicles, even the sound of their own breathing. The sand whipped against Riley's exposed skin like tiny needles. All Viper elements, this is base. Abort the exercise. I repeat, abort the exercise. Hard deck, hard deck. Return to the rally point immediately. The voice in Riley's earpiece was barely audible over the static clipping and breaking before going entirely dead. The electromagnetic interference from the atmospheric dust had completely killed their comms. Riley pulled her shemagh tightly over her mouth and nose, flipping down her night vision goggles. They were useless. The infrared illuminator simply reflected off the dense wall of swirling sand, blinding her with a wall of white noise. She switched to her rifle's thermal scope. Through the thermal lens, the world was a chaotic swirl of cool blues and greys, with the churning dust masking heat signatures. She panned the heavy rifle, slowly looking for the rally point. Instead, she saw a bright, glowing cluster of heat about 400 yards to her right. It was a vehicle, but it wasn't the instructor's Humvee. It was a heavy-duty customized pickup truck, sitting low on its suspension, creeping through the desert, completely blacked out. Riley froze. This wasn't part of the drill. The Norland training area bordered miles of empty, lawless desert that stretched down to the Mexican border. It was a known corridor for heavily armed drug cartels and human smugglers' coyotes who used the vast emptiness to bypass border checkpoints. A vehicle out here running blacked out during a massive storm was a red-level threat. Riley kept her eye pressed to the thermal scope. The truck stopped. 3 doors opened. Through the thermal imaging, she saw 4 distinct heat signatures step out. They were carrying long guns, AK-47 variants unmistakable by their curved magazines and distinct thermal profiles, and they were walking directly toward Derek Cole's last known position. Cole was completely blind. He had likely taken cover behind a rock outcropping, unaware that the smugglers lost in the storm, and paranoid had blundered directly into the military training zone. If they stumbled upon a man in a ghillie suit, they wouldn't ask questions. They would shoot to kill, assuming he was a rival cartel scout or a border patrol sniper. Riley's heart hammered against her ribs. She was supposed to retreat. She was supposed to wait for the instructors, but the instructors were completely blinded by the storm and miles away at the rally point. She only had blanks in her primary magazine, but strapped to the stock of her rifle was a 5-round emergency reserve of live armor-piercing, incendiary API, match-grade ammunition. Strict protocol dictated these were never to be chambered unless under direct, lethal threat. She watched through the thermal scope. One of the smugglers raised his rifle, sweeping the area with a flashlight. The beam cut through the dust, illuminating a patch of burlap just 30 yards ahead of him. Cole. He had frozen in the light, realizing too late what was happening. Riley saw the smuggler shout something inaudible over the wind and raise his AK-47 to his shoulder, aiming dead at Cole. There is no time for permission, Riley thought. Her training took over a cold, mechanical precision overriding her fear. She ejected the magazine of blanks, catching it silently in her left hand. She ripped a single heavy live round from the stock saddle, slid it into the chamber, and drove the bolt forward, locking it in place. She acquired the target in her thermal scope. Distance 410 yards. The wind was chaotic, a swirling vortex of 60 miles per hour that could throw a bullet 5 feet off course. Taking a headshot in this wind was a mathematical gamble. Taking a body shot might not drop him instantly before he pulled his trigger. She needed a target that would completely neutralize the threat and disable the group without risking a miss that would alert them to her position. She shifted her crosshairs off the man and onto the glowing, white-hot engine block of the smuggler's truck, right behind where the armed man was standing. Riley exhaled. She didn't fight the wind. She felt it. She adjusted her holdover, aiming a full mil to the left, trusting the violently swirling haboob to push her heavy. 338 bullet, exactly where it needed to go. She pulled the trigger. The TAC 338 roared a concussive blast of fire and thunder that briefly illuminated the swirling sand around her. Downrange, the massive armor-piercing incendiary round tore through the howling storm. It bypassed the armed smuggler by less than 4 inches, violently slammed into the grille of the truck, and detonated inside the engine block. A blinding flash of sparks and a catastrophic hiss of ruptured metal erupted. The truck's radiator exploded outward in a geyser of superheated steam and fluid. The concussive shockwave and the sudden violent destruction of their vehicle threw the smugglers to the ground in sheer panic. Thinking they were under heavy mortar fire or being engaged by a mounted .50 caliber machine gun, the men scrambled wildly, abandoning their push toward Cole to take cover in a nearby ravine. Riley lay perfectly still, the barrel of her rifle smoking in the freezing wind. Through her thermal scope, she watched the heat signatures retreat. But the danger wasn't over. As the dust swirled around the burning wreckage of the truck, the headlights flickered on, cutting through the sandstorm. And what they illuminated made Riley's blood run cold. The smugglers weren't retreating. They were flanking. And now they knew exactly the general direction the shot had come from. Riley reached up and chambered her second live round. She had 4 bullets left, and the storm was only getting worse. The haboob screamed a deafening roar of displaced air and pulverized earth. Inside the swirling vortex of the storm, Riley Mercer was no longer a 19-year-old Navy SEAL candidate. She was a ghost, an apex predator operating in an environment that had completely blinded her prey. Through her thermal optic, the battlefield was a shifting puzzle of glowing blue and white blobs. The 3 remaining smugglers had recovered from the shock of their truck's engine block detonating. Realizing they weren't under heavy artillery fire, but facing a single precise shooter, their training cartel enforcers, hardened in the brutal turf wars of Sinaloa, kicked in. They didn't retreat. They fanned out, forming a textbook tactical wedge, sweeping toward the ridge where Riley had taken her shot. And one of them was walking directly toward the boulder where Derek Cole was pinned. Cole was effectively neutralized. Without thermal optics and choked by the sand, he had drawn his standard issue Sig Sauer P.226 sidearm, blindly aiming into the dust. He had no idea a heavily armed man with an AK-47 was less than 20 yards away, flanking his blind side. Riley's breathing slowed. The chaotic 60-mile-per-hour wind tore at her burlap ghillie suit, threatening to rip the heavy camouflage right off her back. She chambered her second live armor-piercing incendiary round. 3 bullets left. She tracked the smuggler closing in on Cole. The thermal signature was crisp against the cold desert background. The man was moving fast, his rifle raised. If Riley shot the man in center mass, it would be a lethal hit. But a dead body in a military training zone, even a cartel smuggler's, meant a massive federal investigation, international red tape, and the immediate shutdown of the training program. She needed to neutralize the threat without crossing the lethal threshold, a nearly impossible task in these conditions. Distance 380 yards, wind full value right to left, gusting heavily. Riley shifted her crosshairs off the smuggler's chest, dropping the reticle down to his hands. She was aiming for a target the size of a grapefruit, moving erratically in a blinding storm. She didn't wait for a lull in the wind. There wouldn't be one. She timed her trigger squeeze with the rhythm of the man's footsteps. Pull! The TAC 338 roared again, spitting a 3-foot tongue of fire into the swirling dust. The heavy bullet sliced through the haboob. Downrange, the smuggler's AK-47 violently shattered into a dozen pieces of red-hot shrapnel. The kinetic impact of the round, striking the rifle's steel receiver, tore the weapon completely out of the man's hands, the shockwave snapping his wrist and throwing him violently backward into the dirt. He lay there screaming, clutching his mangled arm, completely incapacitated. But the muzzle flash had just cost Riley her most valuable asset, her concealment. To her left, the remaining 2 smugglers saw the flash. Automatic gunfire immediately erupted, a chaotic spray of 7 62mm rounds tearing through the creosote bushes around Riley's position. Bullets cracked through the air inches above her head, kicking up geysers of sand and showering her with shattered rock. She was pinned. Riley rolled violently to her right, dragging the 24-pound rifle through the dirt. She knew standard evasion tactics wouldn't work. The smugglers were using thermal scopes of their own. They would track her body heat as she moved. She needed a decoy. Without hesitating, Riley reached into her utility pouch and pulled out 3 military-grade chemical heat packs, the kind used to prevent frostbite on high-altitude jumps. She cracked them, shaking them violently until they burned at a blistering 130 degrees. She shoved them deep into the hood of her burlap ghillie suit, ripped the heavy camouflage off her shoulders, and propped it up against a jagged rock. Stripped down to her combat shirt, the freezing wind instantly bit into her skin, but she didn't stop moving. She crawled backward, leaving her glowing, man-sized thermal decoy behind, and flanked 30 yards to the east, burying herself beneath a shallow lip of sandstone. She peered through her scope. The cartel leader, a massive glowing heat signature, was advancing aggressively on her decoy, firing short, controlled bursts into the burlap hood. Riley chambered her 3rd round. She aimed at the leader's right thigh, specifically targeting the femur. Crack-boom. The shot echoed over the howling wind. The leader crumpled instantly, his leg giving out beneath him, as the heavy round passed clean through his thigh, shattering the bone, but missing the femoral artery. He hit the ground, writhing his weapon, tumbling into the darkness. The 4th man, seeing his leader drop and his squad decimated by an invisible force, broke entirely. Panic overrode his training. He dropped his rifle, turned, and sprinted blindly into the blinding wall of the haboob, abandoning his team to the desert. Silence slowly returned to the desert as the gunfire ceased, replaced only by the relentless howling of the wind. Riley didn't move. She kept her crosshairs locked on the 2 downed men, the freezing sand burying her exposed arms. She would hold this position until the storm broke, even if it took all night. Dawn broke over the Nyland training facility, not with sunlight, but with the heavy rhythmic thumping of MH-60 Black Hawk helicopters. The haboob had finally died down, leaving the Mojave Desert blanketed in a thick, eerie layer of pristine, undisturbed beige powder. Master Chief O'Connor and Chief Hayes kicked the doors of their tactical Humvees open before the vehicles even came to a complete halt. They were flanked by a heavily armed, quick reaction force. When comms had gone down and the storm hit, they feared the worst. When they heard the unmistakable booming echoes of a .338 Lapua Magnum firing live rounds, they expected to find body bags. Instead, they found Derek Cole. Cole was standing near the smoking, utterly destroyed wreckage of the cartel pickup truck. His sidearm was drawn, pointing down at the two wounded smugglers who had been heavily zip-tied and given rudimentary combat first aid. The cartel leader was groaning a tourniquet, wrapped high and tight around his shattered thigh. O'Connor sprinted forward, his rifle at the low ready. "Cole status. Are you hit?" "I'm Green Master Chief," Cole said, his voice raspy from inhaled dust. He looked pale, completely shaken, staring at the shattered remains of the smuggler's AK-47 lying in the dirt. "But it wasn't me. I was completely blind. Pinned down." Hayes jogged up his eyes, scanning the horizon. "Who fired the live rounds? Where is Mercer?" Cole didn't speak. He just slowly raised his hand and pointed toward a jagged ridge of sandstone nearly 500 yards away. Hayes pulled up his binoculars. There, lying perfectly still against the rock, barely visible without her ghillie suit and covered in a thick layer of frost and sand, was Riley. Her rifle was still mounted on its bipod, her eye still welded to the glass, providing overwatch over the entire valley. She hadn't moved an inch in 6 hours. "Stand down, Mercer," Hayes barked into his radio. The comms finally clear. "Threat is neutralized. Come on down." 3 hours later, the debriefing room at the base was suffocatingly tense. The air conditioning rattled loudly, but it did little to cool the heat in the room. 2 military police officers stood by the door. Master Chief O'Connor slammed a thick manila folder onto the metal table. "You fired live armor-piercing incendiary ammunition in a blank-fire training exercise, Mercer. Do you have any idea the federal nightmare you've just unleashed? You destroyed a vehicle, maimed 2 foreign nationals, and endangered the life of a fellow candidate. Protocol dictates I strip your trident pin today and hand you over to JAG." Riley sat rigidly at attention, her uniform stiff with dried sweat and dust. Her face was cut and bruised, but her eyes were entirely deadpan. She didn't offer an excuse. She didn't apologize. She neutralized a 4-man hit squad in 0 visibility conditions. Chief Hayes rumbled from the corner of the room, his massive arms crossed over his chest. She shot a rifle out of a man's hands at 400 yards in a 60-mile-an-hour crosswind, Brendan. She intentionally targeted the engine block to disable their transport without causing fatal casualties. The telemetry data on her rifle confirms it. It wasn't reckless. It was the most calculated display of ballistic control I have ever seen in 20 years of warfare. "It's a blatant violation of rules of engagement," O'Connor fired back. Before Hayes could respond, the heavy metal door creaked open. Derek Cole walked in. He had a bandage wrapped over his cheek, and the usual arrogant swagger was completely gone. He looked directly at O'Connor. "Master Chief, with all due respect, to hell with the protocol," Cole said, his voice steady. He turned and looked at Riley. "Those men had thermal. They had me dead to rights. I didn't even know they were there until the truck blew up. If she had followed protocol and retreated to the rally point, I would be bleeding out in the sand right now." Cole walked over to the table and leaned his knuckles on the metal surface. "You wanted to know if she was a liability. You wanted to know if she would crack under the pressure. Well, she didn't. She didn't panic. She didn't miss. She owned the battlefield, and she saved my life." Silence descended on the room, thick and heavy. O'Connor stared at Cole, then looked at the telemetry report on the desk. He sighed, rubbing his temples, feeling the sudden overwhelming weight of the changing times. He looked back at the 19-year-old girl sitting at attention. She wasn't an experiment anymore. She wasn't a political stunt. "Get to the infirmary, Mercer." O'Connor finally grunted, closing the folder. "Get some sleep. Tomorrow we start aerial platform shooting. Don't be late." "Yes, Master Chief," Riley said softly. She stood up, saluted sharply, and walked out of the room. Chief Hayes watched her go, a small, rare smirk pulling at the corner of his mouth. The veterans had laughed when she walked into the desert. But as the heavy steel door clicked shut behind her, no one was laughing anymore. The Phantom of Nyland had arrived, and the SEAL teams would never be the same again. Never underestimate the quiet ones in the room. Sometimes, the most unassuming individuals carry the deadliest focus. Riley Mercer proved that true grit isn't about size or ego. It's about adapting, surviving, and protecting your team when the world goes blind. If this intense real-life story of survival, tactical brilliance, and shattered stereotypes kept you on the edge of your seat, smash that like button. Don't forget to subscribe and share the video to hear more incredible stories of unspoken heroes. Drop a comment below. What would you have done in the storm?